Good morning. Thank you for being here on this cold morning in the interim, but I'm really glad you're here because we have a great speaker today. And I was only able to convince him because his wife, who's in a PhD program, has break and can do the daycare run, right?
She's in a winter course, it turns out.
Oh, okay. I'm not going to ask the details here. But we have a wonderful speaker this morning, Peter Doshi, who a lot of you know, I think, from when he was here. But I'll go chronologically to tell you a little bit about him. He did his BA in anthropology, or AB, at Brown in a while ago. And then he went into Asian studies and did a master's at Harvard. And his PhD was at MIT. And it's a long thing. History, anthropology,
Yes.
and science and technology and society. So it's sort of all-encompassing, but not public health epidemiology. But it's much more interesting. He did a postdoc here. Jody Siegel sponsored him, and I had the pleasure of working with him during the time on the projects that he worked on, and then went to University of Maryland as an assistant professor and as an associate editor at BMJ. So you probably read a lot of what he writes if you read the BMJ regularly. He's maybe best known to some of you at least for his work on the Tamiflu, a systematic review of Tamiflu and its effectiveness and safety, where they got data from the drug companies as well as published data. And then here he started a reporting biases group that met monthly, all the people on campus, and there are quite a few who are interested in reporting biases issues. So that was really fun. I wish he'd started again, because he's just across town at University of Maryland, so we should see one another more often. So Peter, I'm going to hand it over to you.
I'm not, of course, it seems like every time I'm asked to give a talk, I end up doing a lot of the slides again, and I don't know why that happens, and I have to get better at that. But this one ended up being 80 for 45 minutes, so it's untested, and you'll let me know whether it works out in the end, or I'll figure that out soon enough. So to get started, yes, I'm trying a new system where I just do the details and then a lay summary, which is that my salary comes from two sources, my employer at the University of Maryland and the BMJ. And then I also try my best, but usually don't do well, at getting other funding from public and nonprofit sources for research. Have accepted reimbursement, but I'm trying to do less and less of that, even for small things. And then don't take any industry funding. All right, so I'll spend a lot of time saying very little, I suppose, because the answer to my question that I posed at the beginning is I don't think we've won the revolution on data transparency. Are you getting double? Yeah. Can you hear me now? Okay. So the way I'll lay this out is to tell you how I think we got to where we are today. So a bit of the history, perhaps a trip down memory lane for some people in the room. Ask the question, is data sharing new? Because revolution suggests we're in a new place now. And to kind of question that, because in some ways I don't think it is new. But in other ways, it actually, there are some very important big changes in what's going on in this area. And then back to the question why I think we haven't won the revolution. So, long time coming. I think the sort of the intellectual edifice for this entire discussion goes back to the 80s and 90s with concerns over publication bias. And Symes is often, there's the paper you'll see quoted for sort of the historical beginning of the concerns. Ian Chalmers called underreporting of research scientific misconduct. And to pay homage here to Kay Dickerson, our researcher from the University of Maryland. She's from there's a University of Maryland affiliation at the time. So this is these are things that were coming up in the 80s and the 90s, a major concern over the impact, potential implications of what publication bias means to evidence-based medicine. And then there's also this very public aspect to concerns over clinical trials and what we know about the safety and effectiveness of drugs and the truth about that. And the billboard, I think, makes the point better than I can with words. Everybody knows the story of Vioxx, approved 1999, withdrawn in 2004. And there's a more editorial aspect to the Vioxx story as well. With years after publication of the seminal paper on Vioxx, the editors of the New England Journal printed what they called an expression of concern. There's still no formal correction or erratum, but they printed an expression of concern followed the next year by a reaffirmation of their expression of concern, which they wrote. And more than 4 months before the article was published, at least 2 of its authors were aware of critical data on an array of adverse cardiovascular events that were not included in the VIGOR clinical trial. These data, which should have raised concerns about the potential cardiovascular toxicity of Vioxx, are part of an internal Merck memorandum. So you can see that this concern over publication bias is now involving elements of the trial is published, but what was published may not reflect the reality of actual underlying data. And the other very public aspect to these concerns is the dwindling confidence in the pharmaceutical industry, which is really punctuated by a series of fines, Department of Justice cases, usually for off-label marketing of the drugs, but often including acknowledgments. For example, here in 2012, the biggest fine now on record, GlaxoSmithKline agreed to pay the U.S. Department of Justice $3 billion. It included in this settlement, which includes a number of drugs, a number of trials, including off-label marketing, but also that they pled guilty to failing to disclose safety information about Avandia to the FDA. So there's this issue of the truth is in the data, but the data is not always published accurately and shared with everybody it needs to be shared. Now that fine, you'll notice, for GSK is in 2012, but really the concerns about Avandia rose to scientific attention, medical attention in around 2007 when this paper by, I think I've covered the names up, by Steve Nissen and Kathy Wolske was published in the New England Journal. This was a meta-analysis of Avandia, where they looked at the risk of MI, I believe, and other cardiovascular causes. The conclusion was that it increased the risk of MI. Why this was news is they had put together into this meta-analysis trials for which the data had not been published. Where did that data come from? Well, it's an interesting story. I don't think it's here. It actually goes back to 2004. If you remember the Elliott Spitzer case against GSK over Paxil and the misreporting of a journal article in 2001, that settlement was only for $2.5 million, but it also included an agreement that GSK would create a clinical trial register. In that register, they put very still scarce details, but they put synopses of clinical trials, including the unpublished clinical trials. Steve Nissen collected those reports, which happened to include data on MI, put them together as meta-analysis, concluded there's an increased risk. And that's the origin of this paper. So it goes back all the way years before to another legal settlement. Then there's issues about the misrepresentation of data, not just that the data aren't published, but misrepresentation. So Celebrex, this is an interesting one from 2000. I think the class study is probably very key in the marketing efforts of the drug. It suggested that Celebrex was safer than its competition. And the JAMA article, in this case, described a 6-month trial in which Celebrex was associated with a lower incidence of symptomatic ulcers and ulcer complications combined. A little later, we found out in a letter that not many people realized was ever published, of course, that the trial wasn't 6 months long. It was quite a bit longer and a little bit hard to read, I see. But it says, the published class trial differs from the original protocol in primary outcomes, statistical analysis, trial duration, and conclusions. In particular, the unpublished data show that by week 65, celecoxib was associated with a similar number of ulcer complications as diclofenac and ibuprofen. Then there's the Turner paper, I think another seminal paper in this whole history of our understanding of the credibility of clinical trials in the scientific literature. This one is interesting because he looks at a number of antidepressants and characterizes the trials as either positive, as judged by FDA, positive on the primary outcome in favor of the drug, as you'd imagine, questionable, or negative. And what you see here is it's the classic publication bias story where 3% of the positive trials go unpublished, whereas 67% of the negative trials go unpublished. But you also see in this an interesting story of there are trials that are published, but the way in which they're published conflicts with the FDA's judgment. A positive trial or a negative trial or a questionable trial, a questionable trial or a negative trial now becomes published in a different light. This is now, I think, opening up a conversation about reporting bias. Similar study was done, I think. You correct me if you don't think it's similar. I think a similar study with similar implications and conclusions of gabapentin here by Swarup Vegela, whom I think many of you know, and Kay and company, Bobby in the room, where they found same issues of the non-significant negative trials were less likely to be published, and that non-significant primary outcomes in the internal report that was given to the FDA, when it was published, they were published as positive trials, where they're significant on the primary outcome. Now, how did that happen, you might be wondering? There are different outcomes that are reported as positive, as primary outcomes in the published journal article. Then I think there's something, this one just I find very interesting because this is a study that only uses publications and actually looks at the abstract versus the data in the paper and finds that in an enormous, I find 38% and 58% to actually be enormous numbers here because they're finding that spin, as they define, you'll see above, as specific reporting strategies, whatever their motive, to highlight the experimental treatment as beneficial despite a statistically non-significant difference for the primary outcome, or to distract the reader from statistically non-significant results. They find this in 38% of results and 58% of conclusions of the abstracts. So if you're only reading the abstracts, you're getting a much rosier picture of the world than the data that's actually presented in the full paper. Whoops. So I think that the conversation has moved where the buzzword, and this still, I think publication still remains the altar. But for people who really study this day in and day out, I think that it's moved to a term called reporting bias more than publication bias, where publication bias is just one element of a sort of potpourri of various types of biases that affect the conduct and reporting of clinical trials. And we, in a paper that Kate and I and others wrote, we also brought out the term of abandonment to, in my mind at least, to bring a bit of, to cast in a bit of ethical light. And there's an abandonment that occurs when these things happen. And by these things I'm talking about primarily all the things in the previous slides, where I classify them essentially as two different types of misrepresentation. One is absolutely no representation. That's your unpublished trials. Trials don't get published. The other is that trials can get published, but in a way that's distorted. And when either of those happen, I think they reflect an abandonment of the investigators to either publish their trial or to correct, right? Assume the best case scenario, which is these are just mistakes, to correct the mistakes and to leave distorted publications in the scientific literature. So I call them these forms of a trial abandonment. Then there's questions about the investigators themselves, right? So note that the quotes here that you're reading are not quotes of these clinical trial publications, where the primary investigators are academic authors. These PIs are academics, these are not quotes from their paper, they're quotes from an investigation the BMJ ran simultaneous to our systematic review of the anti-influenza drugs, including Tamiflu. We went to John Trenner and Carl Nicholson, who are first authors of these 2 published trials of Tamiflu, asked them for the data on them. They didn't have it. The BMJ asked for them. This is what they said. I did not perform an independent analysis of the primary data. I do not have access to the primary data. Carl Nicholson said he did not recall seeing the primary data and that the statistical analysis had been conducted by Roche. So it really raises questions about whose trial really are these? You look at all the meta-analyses, right? You look at the forest plots and we list trials. We would call this Trenner 2000. Well, why do we give Trenner this kind of credit? And it's simply because he's first author. But I think we should ask questions about who's actually responsible for this trial. And then I think this is an area that isn't well explored. I mean, we have the Declaration of Helsinki, we have the Belmont Report, we have lots in terms of the theory now about the ethics of clinical trials. But I think we're lacking in terms of empirical research about what actually is happening. Of course, IRBs have some insight into what's going on a daily basis, but they're only seeing their one piece of the puzzle at a time. What we're lacking, because protocols generally remain absolutely confidential, nobody can see them, nobody shares them, we're lacking that 30,000-foot perspective on what's actually going on. So bring this one of Tigasil to point out a question about the ethics of non-inferiority trials. So in the case of this drug, there are 4 pivotal trials. There were 2 indications. For example, the implication of complicated skin and skin structure infections. One of the pivotal trials, this trial 3074A1, 305, the primary outcome here is clinical response at the test of cure. So the more people who achieve this, the better. In the 2 arms, these are the results. 200 out of 223, 90% of the people on tigecycline achieve the test of cure. 94% on the alternative. This is an active comparator trial. Already approved drugs, vancomycin and aztreonam, they achieve. So people do better on the already approved older drugs. The confidence interval around the effect estimate is from negative 10% to 1%. The trial nonetheless is considered a success. Now, why is that the case? Why is this not an utter failure? It's because the pre-specified hypothesis, and I'm just curious, this is a clinical trial script. How many people know what non-inferiority trials are? Everybody in the room. IRBs that I've spoken to, none of them know what they are. And I've asked IRBs, I think including Hopkins, for a copy of the informed consent template for a non-inferiority trial. There's no such thing. There's only one template, and it doesn't address the issue of non-inferiority. So that's one of the things I'm looking into now, which is people have said non-inferiority trials are just absolutely unethical. This has been argued. I'm asking the question of, are patients even informed? What are they told about the goals of the study before they enroll in it? So we have consent forms thanks to the European regulator, European Medicines Agency, EMA. We actually have the consent form for this trial and other trials in antibiotics. Antibiotics commonly use non-inferiority designs. And there's nothing that I can find that suggests that patients are told anything about the goal of the study is to ensure that the drug isn't more than X 15% worse than what you could get without enrolling in this trial. In fact, it says you and other patients with complicated skin infections may benefit from this experimental research. So if anything, to my mind here, it's suggesting a standard superiority hypothesis. So to sum it all up, there are ethical concerns both about the way in which research has been reported as well as the way in which the research is actually being conducted. Combine this with all the public attention about these scandals and the fines, and I think that's why open data has emerged as such a popular, very public issue as an answer, or at least one of the big answers to all of these various problems. And Peter Goethe, in his editorial, I like this commentary quite a bit. It sort of encapsulates a lot of the stories that I've told. Says just that point, which is that open data would basically fix all these problems. Data sharing would lead to tremendous benefits. The current situation is just absolutely untenable. Selective reporting of favorable research and biased data analysis being the norm rather than the exception is harmful to patients, has led to the death of tens of thousands. I came into this whole story in 2009 when we were doing an update. You remember the H1N1 global pandemic? During that time, the UK and Australian governments commissioned Cochrane to update its systematic review. Within a month or two after that commission, somebody sent in a comment via that standard submit a comment form on the Cochrane Library website. They submitted a comment and said, there's a problem with your previous update. All of the trials they've included are by the manufacturer, and all the trials have come from one pooled analysis. 8 out of 10 of the trials haven't been published. So we started asking for the data, and that's those quotes you saw earlier of the PIs of the published, they didn't have it. We went to Roche, and Roche sent us some documents, including page one up here. I have a screenshot of page 99. The only problem is this was a 11-page PDF they sent us. I thought, this is really interesting. What about the other pages? They wouldn't give it to us. And so this is what opened my eyes to the whole world of unpublished data. When we finally got this clinical study report, and this is a different trial, but they're all around the same length. Here it is on my desk over in Reed Hall. And I printed it out. No, I just stacked the reams of paper to show you how big it would be had I printed it. I didn't print it out. We were being charged for printing it. This is the trial published in a journal article. Same trial. So somehow somebody figured out how to compress a lot of information into 7 pages, which is a great feat. Except I don't know that everything that I should know about that trial really made it into the journal publication. So you see, even with the best intentions, there is some form of human judgment about what's important going into the production of this. Keeping out all the other factors that we might want to spit in and do it this way, there is human judgment. Is everything in there what I need to know? Do I not need to know anything else in that? If I don't have access to that, it's very hard to answer that question. Yeah, 8,545 pages. So that's what led me down this journey, and we wrote up this paper, this essay arguing that there's really a moral imperative to share these are called clinical study reports or CSRs, with the public. They need to be public documents, not limited to industry and regulators who historically haven't shared them. But then, this is one of the inflection points of the talk. Is data sharing really new? Because this paper suggests that we're not sharing it, and we really need to share it. But this paper from 2009, before we wrote the imperative to share, is a IPD analysis here of a number of trials. They got funding from Roche, so Roche was sharing data, and They gave them the IPD for it. So companies have been sharing data, right? And another IPD analysis here, IPD meta-analysis, and funded by GSK, provided raw data sets and, for independent analysis by the authors. So data sharing is not new. I mean, this is my evidence, at least, to suggest to you that it's not really new. It has been happening. And even in the Tamiflu case, it's interesting. Here are two other guys. You might recognize at least one of the names. Remember, he gave a big talk at Hopkins while I was here. Roche contacted, Roche asked us to perform an independent data analysis. That's at the same time that Roche was refusing our group any access to the data. And here's their contract. Roche will provide Harvard with SAS data sets for 10 Roche-sponsored clinical studies, and analysis would be conducted by Harvard. They didn't pay for it, but Roche asked for it, and they got it, and that's the publication. But here's the thing. Harvard agrees to return to Roche all copies of the database and delete from its system any electronic copies of the data. So it's not open data here. It's the classic form, which I think the other papers were the same as well. Here's the confidentiality agreement that was sent to the lead of our team, Tom Jefferson, where Roche was prepared to send us the data as well. When we said, hey, what about all the pages from the report? Sure, here it is. And so for the purposes of this agreement, confidential information shall mean the existence in terms of this agreement. Just in case you thought that the existence of the agreement was a mistake, here it is. Counterparty agrees, that would be us, not to disclose the existence or terms of this agreement. So we would, I mean, this is an agreement so secret I can't even tell you I signed it. Right? Where'd you get the data? Any other questions? So we didn't sign, and it led to the publication of a systematic review in 2009 that basically had less data than it had in 2006, its previous update, because we refused to accept the published papers on their word. We couldn't get access to any other data, and BMJ, I was not at BMJ at the time. BMJ chose this as a cover story with an editorial by Fiona Godley, who remains editor-in-chief, saying we want raw data now. And I think this is one of the important points in the whole story of open access to data. On the same day that we went to press, Roche, well, in the week prior, Roche had been given the right to reply. You'll remember that BMJ did an investigation simultaneous with this, where they got those quotes about the PIs not ever seeing any of the data. So in Roche's right of reply, there were two of them actually. They talked about all their robust procedures for sharing study reports. Remember, this is 2009. So data sharing, we've been doing it. We have robust procedures and policies and so on and so forth. And they said that the corresponding full study reports, those things that we couldn't get access to, would be made available on a password-protected site within the coming days to physicians and scientists undertaking legitimate analyses. The coming days. Well, it took years to get access to the full data set. When we finally did, with no strings attached, we published this in 2014, the updated review, which I believe is the first Cochrane review to be based entirely on regulatory data, clinical study reports, and things like the FDA medical officers' reviews. We published it as simultaneous with publishing the data. So there are the CSRs, ones for Relenza, 500 megabytes, and the ones for Tamiflu, 700 megabytes. So if you want to see any of the data, all you have to do is go into DRAD. Probably Google is better. I find it difficult to search, but you can download it. It's one click. There's no signing up and secret handshakes or anything. So we have examples of data sharing in the past, but what is different now, what's really going on now, is the enormous number of voices which are speaking about the importance of data sharing and how we should all be doing this and how great it is. And this spans, you'll know, industry to journals to bodies like the WHO. We have campaigns like All Trials. We have regulators saying great things. So for each one of these people, you'll find either a policy statement, you'll find some kind of major statements that really says about how there's a moral and ethical imperative for the public health to share data. That's what's new. So here's the industry's voice here saying that we encourage all medical research to promote medical and scientific advancement by sharing data. And they're committed to sharing data at the patient level. So we're not talking about we'll just share your summaries anymore. We're talking about sharing patient level data. I think this is the real landmark. So if you're taking notes, this is the one to take note of. This is in 2010, the end of 2010. Most people still don't seem to fully know about this one. But the end of 2010, the EMA put out a new policy on access to documents that the regulator holds. That includes clinical trial data. So it's a Freedom of Information Act type policy that has totally revolutionized what's happened in terms of our ability, including Americans, anybody in the world. You don't have to be a EU citizen to access data. They didn't just, have a great weekend and decide, well, let's do this week. This came after a lot of prodding, this policy. Starting in 2007, the Nordic Cochrane Center sent a request, I think for 2 weight loss medicines, to the EMA for access to those clinical study reports. It took them rejection, appeal, confidential meeting. They applied then to the EU Ombudsman. The Ombudsman's office went to meet the EMA, became an intermediary between the Cochrane Group and the EMA. The EMA kept digging in its heels, saying it's confidential business information, confidential, we cannot. To finally the EMA the Ombudsman saying the EMA is guilty of maladministration was the term they used. Subsequent to that decision, EMA said they will provide, and then at the end of the year in 2010, EMA published this new policy. And I've done a couple of analyses where I requested the requests. So I got their metadata on who's requesting what's being requested, how many have they approved, how many have they denied, how many pages have they released. And the very interesting thing here is you find that industry is the top requester. So as industry has dug in its heels, we don't share data only to the people we like. They're the ones who are really making use of this policy. So they're consistently the top requesters for data at EMA. You also see law firms are requesting, the media is requesting. Academia doesn't do too well. So you gotta ask for more data. The only problem is, I think there's a bottleneck, a real bottleneck, in that requests used to go out. There were less requests in the past. I mean, it's just what you'd expect. There are less requests in the past, and they put out more. Now things are slowing down. More requests, less output. They're totally understaffed. This is a completely new thing. They're the first regulatory in the world to have ever done this. It's a fantastic idea, but they really need our support, I think, in making this happen, because right now it is still very slow. So the example I gave you of the consent forms of TIGUS, the non-inferiority trial, that request has been in for over 2 years now, I think. We're still getting it. It's just a month at a time. They've developed a system so that they're technically not violating their sort of responsiveness requirements, but geez, I mean, you wait another month, they say, well, due to Article 4, subchapter 6, 7, 8, we're requesting another 32 days in order to be fair to all of our requesters. I mean, it just goes on and on now. The other policy which people know more about is this one that was published in October 2014, policy 0070. The other one was 0043. This one is the prospective policy for drugs that get approved or denied approval from January 1st, 2014 onwards. And so we think sometime in the middle of this year, we're going to see the first batch of reports for whatever marketing authorization they make become publicly available to the public through a portal website. So it's no longer this mechanism of, EMA, I believe you have the documents. I'd like under Freedom of Information to request them. And they have to dig back and they have to redact them. This is trying to front load it so that they're going to be pre-redacted and the whole package goes up right as soon as the drug is approved. Or, like I said, so it's not just approved drugs, it can also be denied drugs or withdrawn drugs. But it's only for new drugs. So if you're interested in research on an existing drug, older drug, it's not going to be available under this policy. You have to go under the Freedom of Information policy, which has become very slow. This is also new. We have websites like clinicalstudydatarequest.com and 13? It keeps, yeah. So 13 companies now have banded together through, in conjunction with the SAS Institute, they have an online portal where you can see the trials they're making available, and you can submit your request for access to data, including the CSR, the clinical study report, including patient-level data sets. So that's also very new. This is about 2013 onwards. And I think that what this opens is the possibility that with all this access to data, we can do new things, like since we're no longer dealing with just what's above the waterline, the publications, then if you search really hard, the conference abstracts, that's still all above the waterline. We're talking now about the actual records, the actual underlying reports. In the case of industry, the clinical study reports that are created for the very same trials we usually only get glimpses of in the journal article. Now we can be divers and look under the water at all these things. And what can we do? Thanks to the support of first BMJ and PLOS Medicine, the editors of these journals accepted our idea that even if these divers are people like you and me who have nothing to do with the trial, if we find a trial where the investigators never publish it and really aren't interested in publishing it, but we can get access to the data, say through a portal like this, then us non-affiliated people can publish the trial. Well, we'll say to GSK or to Astellas or whoever, do you guys want to publish it? And if they don't respond to that or they say they no, then we will. Now normally that doesn't happen, right? That hasn't ever happened. You have non-investigators, non-sponsors publishing a trial. But that's the concept of RIAT, or Restoring Invisible and Abandoned Trials, is that somebody else can. And so BMJ and PLOS Medicine were the first ones. There are many others now, Lancet included, who have said we'd be happy to consider for possible publication manuscripts under this RIAT initiative that is written by people who may not have anything to do with the original trial. And it also covers the trials that are published, where what was published we can document to have misreported the underlying data. And so the idea is basically, you might expect this, get the data and then transform it into a 10-page journal article for publication, but keep an audit of what you chose and why and where you found it from, so that you're at least being transparent in that process of extreme distillation from 8,000 to 10 pages. Okay, why am I skeptical? Because all these things sound great and we can do great things now. So back to clinicalstudydatarequest.com, where a lot of companies are putting their data. If you look at the details, you'll see, here's Roche's page, for example. Roche is making available all phase 2 and 3 trials. No phase 1s and only some phase 4s. Then there's a restriction on which drugs will be posted, and it's only medications that are approved in both the US and the EU, and some terminated medications. And then it's only trials with greater than 49 patients. Their idea, of course, is to protect the anonymity you might have expected, but there are restrictions. So there's a lot of detail in these great statements about how we should share all data that you have to be aware of. Here's Sanofi's page. They're only sharing phase 2 to 4 trials, approved medicines only, and only those trials that were approved on or after January 2014. So if you want the Sanofi product from 2013 or 2000, make a special request, because that's not what they're planning on sharing here. So what I think we're ending up with right now is this patchwork of policies where, number one, the idea of data ownership is being maintained very, very carefully. So remember, this is a system that doesn't send you a CD or a DVD with the data when your request is approved. They give you access to the SAS Institute system where you can run SAS. They have SAS right now and R available. You can do the programming on their servers, do your analyses, and then queue for download the analyses you want to use in your paper. And then they have a guy who checks the queue. They go, okay, yeah, fine, you can take that out. Can't get the PDFs of that 8,000-page PDF that we put on RIAT. That's not happening through this system. So that's why I say we have data owners. They're really owners, and we're not talking about sharing the data. We're talking about giving access to the data. I think there's a difference. Different policies for different companies, different levels of data. So all these details are creating a system that's very hard to generalize, except that it's perhaps better than before. And then there's something, if you go to these meetings, this is the, running at, is that accurate, 9:14?
Yes.
Okay. I go to a lot of these meetings on data sharing. This is, and Mike Rosenblatt, Chief Medical Officer of Merck, shows up a lot as well. And he's one of the most nervous people on data sharing that I've come across. And so he talks about how it's so important, and they co-sponsored the Institute of Medicine report that you might have seen on this topic. But he talks about many challenges, risks, burdens, and challenges, infrastructure challenges, patient privacy, the sponsor's responsibility to ensure success of data sharing and respect for the data. We must ask if the potential benefits for the specific topic of inquiry is worth the inherent risks of data sharing, knowing that no data set is absolutely secure. So there's a lot of nervousness around this endeavor, behind the very excited public statements that you see being made. There's also a process, right? You don't just go on to that clinicalstudydatarequest.com and start clicking and getting access. You have to make sure that this is good science that you're doing. And so they have an independent review panel that will then evaluate your request. It's a bit like the grants process, right? They're going to make sure it's a good request, that you're respecting the data, so on and so forth. You have the right team. So this is the appendix of a paper that Evan and Kay and I published in BMJ recently, where we describe a little bit of our story trying to get down this kind of chain with AstraZeneca. Because they have the same process of ensuring that your analysis is really good before they give you data. So here we start, send a letter in February. They respond, thank you for contacting, and then it goes, here's my letter, back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth, and back and forth, back and forth. Kay gets involved, get the big guns involved, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Then our paper is published because the drug industry's rhetoric over transparency of clinical trial data may not be reflected in practice. In summary, can we have the data? February. No, sorry. So, took us 8 months to learn that our analysis, which was approved by PCORI, it was not up to snuff for AstraZeneca. That was the end of the story, right? There's no update. They haven't reached out with the...
They have not sent us the data.
Right. Okay, but that's AstraZeneca, right? They weren't on that list of good companies. What about GlaxoSmithKline? They're the poster child for openness and transparency and the biggest fines. GlaxoSmithKline is leading the pack. This is what I wrote. In efforts to liberate access to clinical trial data. They're the one that set up that clinicalstudydatarequest.com system. But then one group tried to get access to the data on that infamous Paxil Study 329 paper. Hit a lot of roadblocks because they asked for the actual case report forms, not just access to the participant level data set, I should say, but the actual case report forms. And they wrote about their struggles because, I think, because the BMJ put some pressure on them over this. I got involved, and while I was writing this story, and GSK said, no, absolutely not, we have a policy that says we can't share this, they decided they could share it. So they, before they sent me a copy of the policy saying they couldn't share it, they said they would share it. And so the reviewers did get access to those case report forms for this trial, 77,000 pages of it, which they could look at one page at a time through this nice portal. So no download of PDFs, remote desktop, look but not touch. You have to download your analysis, as I was saying. No printing. Can't even print those pages out if you wanted. This is, and they mentioned that one of the people basically said, I can't deal with this anymore, I'm out. So it was very stressful for the team. This is what contemporary data sharing looks like in practice. Then there's another aspect of why I'm skeptical. It's because the people who really have all the data are the regulators. They really have all the data, especially, I mean, if you talk about industry data, they have it all. They go across companies, across, therapeutic class. They have so much. And the one that really has it all is FDA, right? Not Health Canada, not EMA. But guess what? At these meetings, FDA says, that I go to, the FDA says, data sharing is fantastic. You guys, all the best with that. Right? This is really what happens at the meetings. We're not in the business of publishing. We're not a publication house. So we're very excited. FDA is very excited that industry is now working with researchers to share data. They're not going to have anything to do with it themselves. And that EMA policy, prospective policy, which should hopefully deal with the bottleneck issue and free up EMA's time, and it's sort of available prospectively now, at least for new drugs. Well, we're still working out the details of how the data should be anonymized to ensure patient confidentiality. And there's one approach called the Transcelerate approach, which industry is really pushing for. And it would take this page of the CSR that is publicly available, Roche gave to us, and we put on RIAT, so anybody can download it here. It will take this, and it will turn it into that. So this should make you nervous about what the EMA's policy really will look like in practice. And then I have an issue, which is the entire discussion is focused on CSRs and IPD data sets. It's like that, as if those are the only two things that might matter. And so I made a list of, of all the other things which might matter that I could think of for any given clinical trial. Manual of operations, the actual CRFs that were filled in, sponsors documents that don't go to regulators, like marketing assessments, email correspondence, meeting minutes. You might think this is prying, and why would you need all these things? Do you really need it? The data should just speak for themselves. I'm not sure data ever speak for themselves, to be honest. That's the social scientist, I guess, in me. But I'll give you just one example of these marketing assessments. This is work by Swaroop and company here. And you'll see in the case of Neurontin, before the trials were done, Park-Davis had a marketing assessment conducted to understand what a possible indication of neuropathic pain might look like for its drug, gabapentin. And one of the things that this document included was a discussion of two alternatives, publication strategy and indication strategy, which they wrote that if you go down the publication strategy, the way it would work is that the results of the recommended exploratory trials in neuropathic pain, if positive, will be published. That was against the regulatory strategy. Regulatory strategy means we'll actually go to FDA and we'll try and get approval for this new indication. Publication strategy, not only is this just a little bit alarming when you read it, but it also means that from the outset, before you even start these trials, the company knows it's not going to be audited when it does these trials. These are not going to receive the kind of scrutiny that they would if it went to the regulator for a new indication. And so I think it tells you something about the quality of the data that will be collected, quality of analysis, because they already know that nobody's watching in the same way. Does that mean necessarily? No. But it does mean that that's known prior to going into the trial. And so I think it affects the data. So final slide. Even if we do have access to all these data, and it's really easy to get, I think that we don't know what we're doing in terms of it's a whole brave new world of data. The process of going through it is very slow. There's a reason FDA takes 6 to 10 months to approve a drug to look at those trials, and we read journal articles in an hour in Journal Club because they're doing something very different when they look at those trials. I think it takes a lot of skill to work through it. In other words, a lot of money, and I don't think we have funders tuned into this issue and ready to fund this kind of work. And then I've been talking about these problems and fixing the problems. I mean, we can't always be playing catch up, right? Because that's always fixing the mistakes after they occur, and I think we need a better solution. And so I didn't put it on the page, but unless what I think the solution might be, because I thought that would be good to discuss, what a real solution to these problems might look like. Thank you very much.
Time for a few questions.
Yeah, for 6 minutes. Ed?
So, thank you, that was great. My question, looking at that slide that you have, like all the different documents, and you know what goes into reviewing all the different documents you might get from the trial.
Mm-hmm.
Do we really want that? Is the amount of effort that it would take to reanalyze the LPD from the trial, to review the CSR, to go through all of the memos and things, and it took you guys years to do the technical review. Can we really do this?
So I do think we want it. I mean, one is if you know somebody's looking, I think you do things differently. You often do things better. If you know somebody can look, you're more inclined to not cut corners that you might otherwise. So it's a good deterrent to begin with. It allows cross-checking. It's not that you're necessarily going to pour through every page. And the question is it really going to change anything whether we have it or we don't? Is an empirical one that I can't answer. I mean, it definitely changed the story in the case. I should correct it. In the case of the study 329, the Paxil study, I don't think it changed the bottom line, but it did give us more insight into how the misreporting occurred when we had access to the CRFs versus just having access to the patient-level data set. So I do think that it's important to have all of these things, and I do think that there will also be a bit of there will be efficiencies that we'll learn over time as we get better at using the documents. I mean, ICWIC has, I think ICWIC, it's Beata Wiesler, has made the point that actually you can save a lot of time using these documents over using publications because there's just less, you have to do less interpreting, or not less interpreting, but you have to be less of a detective, and you can just get to the facts much more quickly when you're dealing with some of these documents. So even though they're long and voluminous, I think that at the beginning might be an impediment, but I think in the long term we might actually be saving ourselves time if this becomes the norm. Jody?
So as FDA gets better with their electronic data collection and more standardization and CDISC, won't it be easier for them to share data? Right now I would imagine that they're just embarrassed to share their data.
I would think it would become easier, but so this is a tricky issue because it mostly involves a discussion about anonymization or de-identification data sets. Because even when you have paper, why is that difficult? I mean, paper is scanned all the time. We've talked to EMA. How people say, well, the data is not in the right state to be shared. It's not ready to be shared, and we've said, well, just give it to us like you have it, and we'll deal with the messiness. People aren't comfortable with that. So it ought to be easier as things are more electronically kept. The CDISC discussion, I think, is a matter of more of using and putting together different trials than it is one of, is the data easily shareable or not? It's more, is it easily analyzable one? And that should be, of course, that's the hope there. So should be, but there's still, we're dealing with too few examples of trials that are very, very modern that are being shared to really give you any good indication.
I remember in cases that we got data from FDA. That was
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You had an interesting.
It was bad.
Hard to analyze, hard to understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. Could you print it out?
Oh yeah. No. It was completely given to us, but
Because
we had to hire a PhD for 2 years to clean it.
Right.
Literally.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
I guess I'm worried that nobody's paying attention. A few people, all of those of us who've worked in this field or whatever, are paying attention. But, we get these little changes that are good, they're great, and it may be that we have actual changes made, like EMA making data public or whatever. But I just don't get the feeling that people care. I mean, for example, the paper of Swaroop's that you mentioned in trials, which I think is so important because it shows just how the cheating happened. It shows the emails and everything. That's probably the paper people haven't read of his on this. They read the New England Journal, PLOS Medicine, but the one that actually shows how it happened in words, I don't think people are reading it, like the indication versus the publication strategy. It's so important. And so, do you have any ideas for how this work could make an impact? I mean, the Biot story made an impact. The Celebrex story made an impact, I think. Probably because big journals got embarrassed or because Elliot Spitzer sued or whatever. But you need something to actually happen, I think. And then...
Yeah, that's my last slide. What's really going to change because I don't think... so I met with the New York State Attorney General's office because I had this interesting connection with them because of this Paxil story. So I got to meet them in person a couple months ago, and I suggested that they don't go for fines anymore, that they actually go to be able to put the handcuffs on people and put people behind bars, because I think it's probably, the whole speeding ticket approach is not changing things. It's not enough. Yes, it raises awareness for a time, but I think until you have some kind of criminal penalty, which applies to probably the CEOs.
Exactly. So that's what one of the authors of that trial paper, lawyer, said. You have to put the CEOs in jail, not the underlings.
Yeah, I'm afraid I came to the same conclusion too.
So, what would be the downside, though? What are some downsides to making the data more available in data sharing?
So the downsides that usually get discussed are, one is rivals will have unfair advantage. So you have the whole commercial confidential concerns, right? The other one is that patients will get re-identified. And so we've violated we've breached the trust. And so that will ruin the entire clinical trials enterprise. And I think a third major one is that misleading analyses will occur. As you'll have these rogue Cochrane and other people who just do this for fun and to poke holes in people's balloons, and so the media is going to have a ball with this. And the example that always gets there's two. One, so this comes from the IOM meeting I was at 2012. Mark Rosenblatt, CMO of Merck, says Andrew Wakefield, misleading analysis, Andrew Wakefield. And I said, what does that have to do with sharing clinical trial data? There was no clinical trial, right? So that's one example. The other is, this came from Janet Woodcock at the FDA. Hormone replacement therapy, or hormone therapy. We have that whole history. Again, what does that have to do? The clinical trial, I thought, set the record straight. Right? That was about observational versus experimental problem. So we don't have actually, since we've really lived in a world of extreme data secrecy, with these select data provisions to select parties, we don't really have good, I think, evidence that misleading analyses are necessarily going to occur. And I would also respond, look at all the stuff I showed at the beginning of this talk. We have tons of examples of misleading analyses happening all the time. So this is a storm we've been weathering. So I don't find any of the
But do you think
arguments.
it would limit what the companies do? They would not do some of their trials because they don't want to put more data out there that could be misused or misanalyzed?
Perhaps. I mean, I have a more cynical view that we're moving away from trials completely. If you look at the 21st Century Cures Act legislation, we're looking at smaller trials, case series, compelling case series, pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic studies. And it's starting with antibiotics, but if you read, they're talking about that as just the start. And then it says other products will follow. So I think at the very same time that we're probably getting somewhere in trial transparency, I think the edifice of trials as the foundation, the bedrock of good evidence-based medicine, I think that is falling apart at the same time. So I think it's actually a sidestep, swerve, dodge. Last one? Oh.
It's 20, well, I
It's
don't
30.
know how long a question you have, Nicole. I know you've been working with CSRs and IPD. If it's very quick.
It's actually, it's sort of unrelated. I just wondered if you thought there was an informed consent issue with older trials. I mean, going forward, there's the idea that you can write into the informed consent document, this data will be released to other people
Yes.
for other purposes.
Yes.
Is there a problem with older trials?
So thank you for that. I forgot that should also go in the list, and it does come up at many of these meetings. Is that we didn't consent the patients for release of the data. At the same time, the patients, as far as I've seen, the forms I've seen, weren't consented for data sequestration and secrecy. So I think the argument runs both ways. And I suggested to Pharma and FBI, which gave a joint presentation at one of these conferences, that at least at the bare minimum, you should post the consent forms for these trials so we can see what the patients were told or not told. They said, oh, that's a very interesting idea, and nobody's ever suggested that, and that was the end of that discussion. Maybe I'll remind Jeff Franzer. I'm talking to him on Thursday about that discussion we had a few years ago. But I'm really not convinced. I mean, this is a point that has been made, and that even if it's 1% of patients that really would object, then at least you have to take their data out of the data set. Those CSRs, I don't think you can identify patients with them.
Sometimes you can.
I mean, they're written so that they are already de-identified. That's one of the criteria.
Yeah.
The appendices are.
What's that?
Appendices aren't. We could
The appendices.
You could well, I would challenge yourself to actually re-identify, not just say I could, but do it, because that's what computer scientists do all the time.
I think
Sometimes their names.
Sometimes their names are there,
initials and birthdays
right?
and town.
of the patients who are in, right?
Where they live, their initials and their birthdays.
Right. So they've been served to you on a silver platter.
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you, and if you have a specific question.